Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me today on Psyched with Setmire. What we'll look at in this brief lecture presentation video are the different models of abnormality. How can we explain mental illness from all the kind of major perspectives within the field of abnormal psychology? So thanks for joining me, and let's talk a little bit about what are models and what are some of the big ones in the field of psychology. And if we look at the idea of a model or a paradigm or a perspective, psychology really has quite a few influential models of abnormal behavior. Psychology is definitely all about different theories, and that's the case here as well. A model is basically just a set of assumptions or concepts that help psychologists or scientists explain and interpret their observations. And as I said, it's sometimes called a paradigm. And models just spell out basic assumptions, in this case about a disorder, and they set the guidelines then for investigation, for causes, for treatment, how we're going to then view and treat that disorder. And the interesting thing about these models is sometimes they conflict with each other. Some have better support than others, so you might like or dislike some of them. And it's definitely the case that some have better support than others, especially for certain disorders. So some disorders like depression might be more strongly supported by a biological model per se than maybe phobias being a behavioral one. So let's look at what these different models are and how they might set the stage for some of the different mental illnesses that we're going to talk about. So the first model, very, very common approach, is the medical or biological model. And according to this perspective, or this paradigm, this approach, psychological disorders have a biochemical or physiological basis to them, a medical physical basis. So when we're looking at the causes of a disorder, we're looking at things like genetic influences, hormonal imbalances, neurotransmitters, and chemical imbalances are a really big element for a lot of the disorders. We might be looking at brain anatomy, but we're looking for a physical or a biological, physiological explanation for that mental illness. And then we're going to turn around and then treat the disorder through the same lens. So if we believe that depression is caused by an imbalance in serotonin, right, then we might give someone a medication that's going to alter their levels of serotonin to then treat the depression. Another model, very famous model, the psychoanalytic model, which was Freud's ideas, really looks at disorders being the result of unconscious internal conflicts, things that we're not kind of aware of on a typical basis. Freud talked quite a bit about how disorders tended to have roots in early childhood, in our sexual and aggressive urges, and then also the unconscious mind. So if we believe that a disorder is caused by something way back in early childhood, something unconscious, then we're going to spend our time in therapy going back, trying to find the root of it, and then work through it in order to help the current moment. The cognitive behavioral model, which you could look at individually, a cognitive model or a behavioral one, here we're putting them together, which is a very common approach, says that disorders result from learning maladaptive ways of thinking and behaving. So here we're going to look at the thoughts and the behaviors that are contributing to a person's mental illness. So what have they been conditioned into, right? What are the thought patterns that are fueling their disorder? And again, to go back to depression, very, very common that negative thinking patterns can fuel someone's negative cycle of depression. And behavioral stuff, we might look at things like phobias, what life experiences or conditioning or events might have caused you to have a specific fear of something, and then how can we then go through and undo that? The diathesis stress model says that people are biologically predisposed to a mental illness or a mental disorder will tend to exhibit that disorder only when they have like a stressor or a trigger that might then enact it. So the idea here is that we're genetically predisposed to something, and then there's some kind of environmental trigger like stress or trauma that then causes that genetic predisposition to come out. So this is a really common perspective for schizophrenia, for example, that someone might have a genetic predisposition and then trauma of maybe combat or a very negative drug experience might then trigger that predisposition to kind of come to the surface. So if you never had that environmental trigger, that genetic predisposition might lie dormant, right? And that's kind of the idea behind this model. And then finally, the systems approach, or the biopsychosocial approach, says that biology, psychology, and social risk factors combine together to produce a disorder. So this one, the biopsychosocial model, is kind of a combination of everything. And I always tell my students that if you ever want to sound brilliant in psychology, say that it was a combination of factors, right, that led to the disorder, or that led to whatnot. And, you know, typically that's probably the most correct answer. So according to this perspective, everything can combine together to cause a mental illness, and therefore we might use a wide variety of methods to then treat that individual. So again, these are some of the kind of basic models of abnormality, different lenses that we can view a disorder through that, of course, then dictate our treatment and our approach. So thanks for joining me. I hope that helps to clear this up a little bit, and I hope you join me again in the future.